An NBA star has just declared himself eligible for the WNBA Draft, and the reason behind it has turned an already heated debate into an even bigger controversy. Former NBA player Enes Kanter Freedom says he has reviewed the WNBA's eligibility rules and is officially declaring himself a prospect for the 2027 WNBA Draft. But this isn't simply a former basketball player making a joke. Freedom is arguing that the league's own language creates questions about exactly who qualifies to play. And now, his declaration is forcing the WNBA into a conversation it may not have expected. The controversy comes at a time when players like Sophie Cunningham have already faced intense criticism after speaking publicly about protecting women's sports. Cunningham has argued that young girls and women deserve protected opportunities to compete, while other players and coaches inside the league have strongly emphasized inclusion and support for transgender athletes. So how did one statement turn into a major debate involving the WNBA, the Players Union, Sophie Cunningham, Caitlin Clark, and even Brittany Griner? Let's break it all down. Freedom's announcement focused heavily on the wording of the WNBA's eligibility rules. According to the argument presented in his declaration, the league's collective bargaining framework says that players must be women to be eligible, but the word woman itself is not clearly defined in the way Freedom believes it should be. He says his team examined the league's rules surrounding eligibility, self-identification, and inclusion before reaching its conclusion. His message was essentially this: if the league wants to emphasize self-identification and inclusion, then those principles should be applied consistently. That is the foundation of his challenge. The important point here is that Freedom is not simply saying, "I want to play in the WNBA." He is attempting to turn the league's own language into the center of the argument. His declaration says that he is not trying to mock or disrespect anyone, but instead wants the rules to be applied equally. Whether the league ultimately agrees with his interpretation is a completely different question. Declaring yourself eligible does not automatically mean a player has satisfied every eligibility requirement. But the declaration itself creates pressure because it demands an answer. And Freedom's argument becomes even more interesting when you look at the wider debate surrounding transgender athletes. Case of Julie Tartat, a French transgender basketball player who reportedly had an impressive season in France's second-tier women's competition. Her performance reignited questions about whether a player in that situation could eventually pursue opportunities in a league such as a WNBA. The point Freedom is making is that this discussion is no longer theoretical. Different leagues and countries have already had to confront questions surrounding eligibility, competition, and inclusion. But before Freedom entered the picture, Sophie Cunningham had already stepped directly into this debate. In an ESPN profile, Cunningham spoke about her belief that young girls should be protected in women's sports. She emphasized that her comments were not intended as hatred toward transgender people. Cunningham repeatedly said that she believes there should be room for everyone, while also maintaining that women's sports need protection for biological women. She connected her position to the broader history of women's athletics and Title IX, arguing that protecting opportunities for women has always been an important part of the growth of women's sports. Cunningham's comments immediately became controversial. Some people supported her position, while others accused her of attacking transgender athletes. Cunningham pushed back against that criticism, saying she had never claimed to hate the transgender community, was that inclusion and protection could both matter at the same time. But inside the WNBA, Cunningham's position was met with very different responses. Minnesota Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve publicly emphasized inclusion and pushed back against the idea that transgender athletes represent the biggest problem facing women's sports. Other players also spoke about creating an environment where athletes can belong and compete authentically. Natalie Nakase discussed the importance of belonging and inclusivity, while Gabby Williams said she would welcome a transgender athlete onto her team or against a team. That created a major divide in the public conversation. Cunningham was arguing for stronger protections for women's sports, while other prominent voices inside the league were emphasizing inclusion for transgender athletes. Neither side appeared willing to completely surrender its position. And then the debate moved outside the WNBA. Stephen A. Smith spent significant time discussing the issue on television and criticized the idea of transgender women competing in women's sports, framing his position as being about protecting girls and women rather than attacking transgender people. The debate quickly became much bigger than one player or one coach. It became a national argument about fairness, inclusion, competitive balance, and the future of women's sports. Social media personalities and commentators pushed the controversy even further, with some using satire to mock the competing positions. But then the conversation returned to Caitlin Clark. Clark has repeatedly experienced physical contact during games without receiving the whistles many fans expected. It highlights several incidents involving Brittany Griner and other defensive situations surrounding Clark. Some fans have interpreted those moments as evidence of inconsistent officiating, while others see them as normal physicality within professional basketball. Contact between Griner and Clark during a game in 2024. Another example involves a later matchup in which Clark absorbed significant contact while officials allowed play to continue. Build a larger argument about whether Clark receives consistent protection from officials. However, it is important to separate what is visible on the court from conclusions about intent. A missed foul call can be controversial without proving that officials or the league are deliberately targeting a particular player. The same applies to claims about individual players. Physical plays can look different depending on the camera angle, the referee's position, and the context of the possession. That distinction matters because a controversy surrounding Clark has become one of the biggest storylines in women's basketball. Clark has become one of the most recognizable players in the sport, and enormous attention follows her every game. That attention means every hard foul, missed call, technical foul, and physical confrontation can become a viral moment. Some fans believe the league needs to do more to protect its biggest young star. Others argue that Clark is simply experiencing the same physical challenges that many professional basketball players face. And this is where Freedom's declaration connects everything together. His argument isn't only about whether he personally belongs in the WNBA. He is challenging the league to explain its rules and demonstrate how those rules are supposed to work. If the WNBA believes its eligibility standards clearly exclude him, then the league has to explain why. If the league believes its inclusion language leaves room for different interpretations, then it has to explain what those boundaries actually are. That is the uncomfortable part of this controversy. The WNBA and WNBPA have publicly emphasized principles such as justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. At the same time, the league has to maintain eligibility standards for professional women's basketball competition. Those two goals can exist together, but the exact rules have to be clear. Freedom is attempting to exploit what he sees as that ambiguity. His message is essentially, if these principles are important, apply them consistently. If there are limits, define those limits clearly. That puts the league in a difficult public relations position. If the WNBA rejects Freedom's declaration, critics can argue that the league's inclusion language has limits that were never clearly explained. If the league was somehow to accept his eligibility argument, it would create an entirely different set of questions about competitive fairness, roster construction, and the purpose of a women's professional sports league. Either way, the league has to explain itself, and that may be the biggest impact of Freedom's announcement. He does not actually need to make a WNBA roster to create controversy. He only needs to force the league to answer a question it would rather avoid. At the same time, Sophie Cunningham's comments have become part of the same conversation. She has argued that women's sports deserve specific protections, while players such as Reeve, Nakase, and Williams have emphasized inclusion and acceptance of transgender athletes. These positions represent a much broader debate happening across sports. The challenge is finding a way to discuss that debate without turning every disagreement into a personal attack. Because underneath all the headlines, there are real questions. How should eligibility rules be written? How should competitive fairness be evaluated? What does inclusion mean in professional sports? How should women's leagues balance those principles? And who should ultimately make those decisions? The leagues, the players' unions, lawmakers, governing bodies, or some combination of them? Those are much bigger questions than one viral clip. And Caitlin Clark is standing right in the middle of the attention surrounding women's basketball. Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the Indiana Fever have become major parts of the WNBA's growing audience. Every controversy involving them attracts enormous attention because fans are emotionally invested in what happens next. That means the league cannot simply assume these debates will disappear. The WNBA is growing rapidly, but growth also brings pressure. More viewers means more scrutiny. More stars means more criticism. And more attention means every policy decision becomes a public conversation. Freedom's declaration has therefore created something the league cannot easily ignore, a direct challenge to its stated principles and eligibility framework. But there's another important point. A declaration is not the same thing as acceptance. Freedom can announce his intention to enter the draft, but the WNBA ultimately determines whether he satisfies its eligibility requirements. Until the league officially responds, many of the strongest conclusions being made online remain speculation, and that is why the next response from the WNBA could matter more than the original announcement. If the league explains its eligibility rules clearly, the controversy may finally have a defined framework. If the league remains silent, fans and commentators will continue filling in the blanks themselves. For Sophie Cunningham, this controversy is about protecting women's sports. For players like Reeve, Nakes, and Williams, the issue is about inclusion and making transgender athletes feel welcome. For Freedom, the issue is about consistency, whether the league will apply the principles it publicly promotes to everyone who challenges its rules. And for Caitlin Clark in the Indiana Fever, the controversy is happening while they are simply trying to compete. That may be the strangest part of this entire story. A conversation that started with one former NBA player declaring himself a WNBA prospect has now connected to the future of women's sports, transgender inclusion, Title IX, league policy, officiating, Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the enormous spotlight surrounding the WNBA. The debate is clearly not going away. The WNBA now has a choice: explain the rules, clarify the policy, and address the questions directly, or allow the controversy to continue growing on its own. Whatever happens next, one thing is certain: Freedom's announcement has forced the league into a conversation about what its rules actually mean. And that conversation could become much bigger than one potential draft declaration. So what do you think? Should the WNBA clarify its eligibility rules more clearly? Do you agree with Sophie Cunningham's argument about protecting women's sports? Or do you believe the league's priority should be broader inclusion? And how should the WNBA handle Freedom's declaration? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more WNBA and basketball stories.